So here we are at Concept 51.2. We're going to talk a little bit about learning and variability of response, because up to this point we've primarily been talking about things that are the behaviors that are the same throughout the entire species. For example, when we looked at the fixed action pattern or the courtship stimulus response chain or the pheromone signaling, pretty much all the individuals in a population are going to act the same way and show the same behavior regardless of their experiences within their lifetime. When they get that particular signal, they're going to behave in a certain way. So it doesn't show a lot of variability. Well, next we're going to look at some variability, how different creatures sort of learn and begin to respond to their environment differently based on their own personal experiences. So Concept 51.2 says learning establishes specific links between experience and behavior. And we're going to start with the most basic, which is called innate behavior. That's the one that does not change between the individuals of a population. That is developmentally fixed and doesn't vary and is really not much under the control of the creature. Like those fixed action responses that we were talking about, these innate behaviors are something you're born with. And a good example of that is when a little baby grasps the finger of an adult or a human person who sticks their finger in their hand, and you see that, and it's certainly cute. I mean, it melts your heart, particularly if it's your own child, your own infant child. When they're newly born, they reach out and you put your finger in their palm and they grasp that. But you need to know that that's an innate behavior. It's found in pretty much all primates and certainly in all human babies. And you could stick a pencil in there or a hot dog in there and they would grab it just the same. So while we attach an emotional aspect to that, that's certainly not something that the baby is clearly thinking, because they would grab a hold of a hot dog or a pencil just as well, and they'll do the same thing with their feet. If you were to put your finger up near their feet and toes, they'll kind of grasp on as well, just like a young monkey might grasp on to its mother's back or hang on to a branch or a limb or something to that effect. This is an innate behavior. It's developmentally fixed, and it doesn't matter where the child is born or who the child is born to or what race the child is or anything like that. They all show this same exact response, this grasping behavior, this grasping mechanism. That's a good example of innate behavior. One great question that scientists often grapple with is, how do you know if a behavior is fixed and innate, or if experiences during that creature's lifetime may actually influence the response? How do you know if this behavior that you see is a part of their genetic code, sort of unchanging, or is it a learned sort of response that can be different between different creatures of the same species? Well, a good way to find out is by doing something called cross-fostering. Cross-fostering studies help behavioral ecologists determine what the contribution is of the environment to the animal's behavior. And you kind of hear this phrase, nature versus nurture, and that's kind of what we're studying here. Is the nature, is it the fixed genetics that is making up the most of this behavior, or is it nurture? Is it what the animal experiences and its learning that has more of a basis for this behavior, or more of a response for this behavior? So cross-fostering studies, what they do is they place the young babies from one species in the care of adults from another species. So you take one creature and you have it raised by a different species, and that way you can tell, is it the genetic component or the raising, the nurturing, the environmental component that's causing the behavior that you see. A simple example of this would be for example you may have seen before on the news or read on the internet. Like, let's say there is a litter of baby kittens, and for some reason the mother abandons them or gets killed, and humans sometimes take the little litter of baby kittens and find a mother dog who is producing milk with puppies, and you can raise the kittens with the puppies, and sometimes that will work and the mother dog will take care of the kittens just like they were one of her own puppies. Well, those little kittens are probably going to grow up to purr, just like all other cats do. That would tell you that purring is an innate behavior. It is a fixed biological genetic component type of behavior. It's not something they learned from their moms, because their mom was a dog and she certainly did not purr. So when cats purr, that tells you that it is an innate fixed behavior. It has less to do with environment and more to do with biology. And that's a great example of cross fostering. So another good example they show in the textbook is with a particular type of mice, California mice and white-footed mice. And some of these mice are more aggressive than others, and they were trying to figure out, is it the social environment? Do they learn to be aggressive because of their parents, or is that genetically kind of hardwired into who and what they are? So they did some cross fostering with these two different breeds of mice, these two different species of mice, one which is kind of laid back and not very aggressive, and one which was more aggressive. What they found was the baby mice tended to behave as their parents behaved. So they tended to take on the behaviors that were consistent with their foster parents, not necessarily with their species or breed. The California mice, the males tend to be very aggressive, and the white-footed mice, the males tend to be not very aggressive. But what they found was when you take a California male mouse baby and have it raised by white-footed mice, it reduces their aggression. And the reverse was true as well. When the white-footed, less aggressive mouse is raised by the California, more aggressive mice, they become more aggressive in neutral situations. So it was the foster parents raising the social behavior that had an influence on how these mice behaved, aggressive or not. It had more to do with nurture and less to do with nature, the genetic component. So that's a good example of cross-fostering in how you can determine if a particular behavior has a heavy genetic, biological component, or it is more about environment and experience. We can also do this in humans. We do what we call twin studies. Twin studies is where we have two identical twins, and in particular what scientists try to do is they try to locate identical twins who for some reason have been separated early on in their childhood or early on in their life, and potentially raised by two different sets of parents in two different parts of the world or two different parts of the country, and they can see what do these twins have in common, what do they have that's different, because particularly in these identical twins who biologically are virtually identical, virtually the same, if you see some differences in behavior, you can associate some of those differences with their environment and how they were raised. So of course we wouldn't have humans raised by another species necessarily, but there's another way of doing this cross-fostering study in humans by looking at identical twins who have been raised in different environments. So if we find out that the behavior is based on experience, well then we call that learning. If an animal behaves in a certain way or responds to a certain stimulus differently perhaps than his brother or neighbor animal, well that is called learning. It's based on his own personal experience, and learning is a modification of behavior based on specific experiences. And it's one of the most powerful ways that environmental conditions can influence behavior, is basically the animal learns how to respond based on his surroundings, his experiences, his environment. So kind of a funny picture over here with the little mouse and learning and his experiences there. So what we want to do next is we want to talk about a couple different methods or types of learning. And again, we're going to start off with the more simplistic, and then we'll kind of move up to the more complex. Perhaps one of the most simplistic types of learning, not even perhaps learning in the way that you think about it, but it is a type of learning because the creature is responding to its environment and its specific experiences, is called imprinting. And imprinting is a behavior that includes both learning and innate components, and it's generally irreversible. So there is some learning going on, but it's also tied in heavily with the unchangeable innate component of this. And imprinting occurs in what we call a sensitive period. So imprinting is learning that happens at a specific time in the animal's life, usually very early on in the animal's life, shortly after its birth or shortly after it hatches. And that sensitive period is this limited window or developmental phase, and that's the only time when this certain behavior can be learned. It's like, say for example, Of course, this is not true, but let's say that in human beings, to teach a human how to snap their fingers, let's say that had to occur between the ages of 4 and 5, or the human could never learn to snap their fingers. Of course, that's not true, but that would be an analogy to what we're talking about with this imprinting behavior. In the real world, in the animal kingdom, we see this oftentimes in birds, where, say for example, the best example in your textbook and that you can usually find on the internet is with this particular scientist named Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz was using young geese, and he showed that the geese, the baby geese, when they hatch out of the egg, they don't necessarily have an intuitive understanding of what their mother is or what their mother looks like, that goose is their mother. They basically imprint on the nearest large moving object, and they begin to think of that object as their mother. So what Konrad Lorenz did was he imprinted himself on the baby geese as their parent or as their mother. The imprint stimulus in these gray-lag geese is whatever large nearby object is moving away from the young geese. They don't have this innate recognition of mother. They simply attach that imprint onto the nearest object that's larger than them that's moving around. So here's a great picture of Konrad Lorenz and some of his geese. So these baby geese, they basically treated Konrad Lorenz as their mother, and they would follow him everywhere, just like baby geese follow their usual mother. And he could kind of call to them, and they would basically chirp and follow after him as if he were their parent. Conservation biologists have even made use of this imprinting behavior and taken advantage of it. For example, in the book it talks about how they have used it to help bolster the number and save the number of whooping cranes. Whooping cranes are a very cool type of crane that can be found here actually in Texas, down in South Texas along the coast. And to save them from extinction, they would raise babies and incubate the eggs and then raise the babies, and they would actually have humans in crane suits. The whooping crane actually, when it's full grown, is about 4 or 5 feet tall, so you could have a human wearing kind of a whooping crane suit, and it would kind of imprint on the baby chicks and fool them, and then that adult human in the crane suit would actually lead crane migrations using an ultralight aircraft, because it's the parents that teach the babies how to migrate, where to go, sort of, and that type of thing. And so if you don't teach them, they would never know exactly where to go and when to go, and so the adults would use ultralight aircraft to lead these whooping cranes on their first migrations and kind of teach them the way and then kind of set them free. You may even recall a movie that came out in 1996 called Fly Away Home that was based on this phenomena, where a scientist used ultralight aircraft to lead various birds like geese and whooping cranes on their first maiden voyage for migrating. There's even a kind of a cool picture right here. So here are some whooping cranes, and this pilot wearing a little whooping crane outfit is basically leading them on their initial first migration to teach them how to migrate and how to be whooping cranes. Pretty weird. The next type of learning we're going to take a look at is a little bit more complex. It's called spatial learning and cognitive maps, and that's kind of a learning based on your environment and the things around you, based on experience with the spatial structure of the environment, like landmarks, where things are and how things are laid out. You're basically creating a mental map in your mind, and there's lots of animals that do this to kind of find their way around or to remember where they placed objects, things of that nature. Nico Tinbergen showed how digger wasps use landmarks to find their nest entrances. Digger wasps are these little creatures that build nests in the ground. They build a little burrow in the ground in the sand, but what would happen is when they leave to go hunt, the female digger wasp would actually cover up her burrow entrance with sand so no other wasp or creature would get in there. So when they were flying back, the question was, how could they possibly find their burrow? It's just sand dunes and dirt. How would they know exactly where to go? And yet these female wasps would fly right back to where their covered burrow was and uncover it, go back down inside. So Nico was trying to figure out, how do they know where exactly to go? Because from the air or from a foot away, it's covered and it just looks like dirt. What are they using to basically navigate to that point? Basically what he found was they use landmarks. They use a spatial mental map. And so, for example, he did some experiments where he would place pine cones around the nest of a particular digger wasp, and basically the wasp would learn, and it would use those pine cones as its own mental map to find its way back. Well, then what he would do is, when the wasp had left to go forage for the day, he would actually move the pine cones slightly to one side, and when the wasp would come back, it would go directly to the middle of the pine cones. So it would skip over where its nest actually was, and it would go to this empty spot where there was no nest. And that's because it was using the pine cones as this spatial learning map. It knew, okay, my nest is in the middle of this set of pine cones, but then when it came back, it would go right there and would be quite confused because it couldn't find its nest. So basically the creatures are creating what we call a cognitive map. It's a mental map inside your brain, an internal representation of the relationship of various objects in your environment. And another good example of this, an even more complex example, is in a particular type of jay, kind of like a blue jay, called a Clark's nutcracker. The Clark's nutcracker can find food hidden in various caches located halfway between particular landmarks. So they've done some experiments that show that this bird not only recognizes landmarks, but recognizes the idea of, okay, midway between this tree and this tree is where I put it. So where they placed their nuts, there may not be any significant object to take note of, but they can say, okay, between these two objects, I know I placed it about midway, or I placed it about 2/3 of the way, or something like that. That's getting pretty smart for a bird to understand that the object is midway between these two objects and to have this mental map in their mind. Clark's nutcrackers are a type of bird called a corvid. That would include jays, crows, ravens, well known for having great intelligence. And when you get the chance, and I'll mention this clip later, there is this great clip on YouTube of a scary smart crow, and it shows you the great amount of intelligence that these birds have and their ability to form mental maps and to solve problems. It's probably quite a bit more than you perhaps thought it was. The next type of learning is called associative learning. In associative learning, animals associate one feature of their environment with another. And a great example of this is animals who eat another creature that turns out to be disgusting or poisonous or bad tasting, and they learn to avoid that creature in the future. So the book says a white-footed mouse will avoid eating caterpillars with a specific color after a bad experience with a distasteful monarch butterfly caterpillar. So the mouse learns, okay, I'm not going to eat any caterpillar, say, that's green with red stripes, because the last time I did that, I threw up and it made me sick. That's what we call associative learning. Here's a great example of a poor blue jay. Monarch butterflies are well known for being very distasteful, and so their bright colors are also serve as a warning to other creatures. They may eat one monarch butterfly, but they learn not to eat any more. So here's a blue jay eating a monarch butterfly, makes him sick, he throws up. He's probably learned his lesson. He'll probably avoid monarch butterflies in the future. That's what we call associative learning. He begins to recognize this color and associates it with this feeling of being sick and throwing up, and so he learns to avoid it. Associative learning has a long history of experimentation with scientists and biologists. There's basically two types we can look at. This one you've heard, I'm sure. It's called classical conditioning. Is a type of associative learning in which an arbitrary stimulus is associated with a reward or punishment. And so you basically take something that really has nothing to do with the reward or punishment, but you condition the creature to associate the two. And the best example is the classic experiment, Pavlov's dog. So Dr. Pavlov, you can look him up on the internet and find lots of information about the various experiments that he did, but he basically trained dogs so that he would ring a bell and then he would provide them with food, and he would ring a bell and provide them with food over and over and over again. So you are conditioning them, this associative learning in which they begin to associate the ringing of the bell with, okay, I'm about to get some food. And what he found was he could then ring the bell and the dogs would begin to salivate. They would begin to produce saliva because they were anticipating the food that was about to come. So that is classical conditioning. The bell has nothing to do with food, and there's no reason that the bell should remind the dogs of food in any way, but they have become conditioned so that when they hear the bell, their body automatically responded by producing saliva. That's classical conditioning. The other good example is called operant conditioning, and that's a type of associative learning in which an animal learns to associate something that it does with a reward or a punishment. It's also called trial and error learning, and this would be a way that we train lots of different animals. So you can train a creature like a rat or a cat or a dog or a killer whale at SeaWorld using this trial and error operant conditioning. An example is if you put a rat in a particular cage that has like a lever and a light, and you don't really do anything, the mouse may at one point accidentally press the lever. When he accidentally presses a lever, a food pellet gets released. And then later on, the next time he accidentally presses a lever, a food pellet gets released. Well, pretty soon the mouse learns, okay, when I press the lever, a food pellet gets released, and you can train him to press the lever or to do the task. So we do this with dogs all the time. Like, for example, if you want to train your dog to sit up or beg or shake hands, you might try to start with when he does it automatically. If you're trying to teach your dog to sit, when you're walking him and he sits, you praise him or you give him a treat. And the next time he does it, you praise him and give him a treat. And then you try to move on to the command sit, and you try to associate the word sit with the action sit with the treat. And so pretty soon the dog learns to associate all of those things. That's operant conditioning. Then when the dog hears the word sit, he understands the action that's required to receive the reward. So that's very, very common in animal training. Another example is to avoid some sort of punishment. A predator may learn to avoid a specific type of prey associated with a painful experience. A dog, after being attacked by a porcupine, may learn pretty quickly to avoid porcupines in the future. So that's operant conditioning. It's about reward and punishment and associating a particular behavior with reward or punishment. Oh yeah, by the way, this works great with humans too. So if you want to train your children or train your students, it works very well on humans, just as well as it works on dogs. Finally, we want to talk about some of the most complex forms of learning, and that would involve something we call cognition. Cognition is the whole thinking process, the process of knowing that includes awareness and reasoning and recollection and judgment. And you might think, well, only humans have what we call cognition. But you would be surprised. Of course, cognition is not just an on or off, yes or no type thing. There are going to be variations and degrees of cognition, but even some simple creatures like a honeybee have a type of cognition. A honeybee, for example, can distinguish between the idea, the concept of same and different. There is no physical object that you could associate with same and different. That is a concept, an idea, but even a honeybee can learn to use cognition and develop that thinking process. A great example is in your textbook where they used two different types of sort of mazes that these honeybees would go into. The bees were trained in a color maze. When they would enter through the first entrance, they would see a particular color. And when they would pass through that color entrance, then they had the choice of going to that same color or a different color. And very quickly the bees learned that you go to whatever the first color of the stimulus was, that's where the food's going to be. So if they changed the stimulus to red, and there was a red and yellow, they would go to the red. Or for example, if they changed this box that you see where the stimulus was yellow, the bee learned to go into the yellow and the food was going to be over there. So the bee learned this idea that you go to the same. Now what they did was then they changed it to where they didn't use colors, they used a pattern. They would either use horizontal or vertical lines. And without training the bees would then fly through, they would see this horizontal line pattern, and they would tend to pick in a larger percentage or greater number the horizontal lined pattern box to go into. So they understand same because the horizontal bar pattern has nothing to do with the color. The only thing that is alike here is the concept of different or same. and the bees could understand that. So that is definitely cognition. Alright, we're going to take a quick break. I just don't want this video to be too long. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to even move up higher to probably the highest form of thinking, which would be problem solving. So that involves thinking and remembering and cognition, and then coming up with a new strategy to attack a particular situation. So we'll come back and take care of that one, problem solving, in just a second.